40, there's a group of 40 or so folks all
Okay.
together. Everybody sees and hears us.
Okay.
So we're just glad you were able to make it.
Yes.
Folks,
Totally. Oh.
technology, you love it. It's just that simple. If we
Yeah.
were in person, it would be a little bit different. We would be stuck maybe at the coffee station.
Yeah.
But as we pick up here, Melissa, take your breath. I'll do a little bit of an of an
Okay.
introduction, and we'll get you up and going. The I'm very excited. So there's that number one. This will be the first of this type of address to what we called our advocacy Tea Talks group. Um, so we're very happy with the presentation. Just a little bit of housekeeping. We are recording. We do place these recordings on YouTube. That's something new. So for folks to know, you'll be able to access that a little bit later. We also have and are blessed with Kathy Donner here this morning to be able to provide interpreting services. My team here includes Denny and Vern as our tech folks. Then we have Bridget and Crystal as the people who help create these Tea Talks in this advocacy series. I'm Eric Gurley, Executive Director here at Access Alaska. And our goal today is to continue our talk about advocacy, one of the 5 core principles, core services of Centers for Independent Living. I was blessed to be able to participate this fall in an 8-week series the Federal Bureau of Investigation put on called Citizens Academy. In that, folks are invited from leadership positions in the community to come learn about the Federal Bureau of Investigation and allow them, the FBI, to have contacts within the community by which they can perform outreach and be connected to the community. If you know me, I have lots of questions. So I had lots of questions for the folks. And in particular, one of them was, I've been in this field a long time and I just haven't had anyone ever present in any venue with the multiple places I've worked for, speaking about civil rights, in particular for people who experience disabilities who may be involved in a hate crime. And so I asked if we could have that presentation, and you're going to get to meet our presenter today, Miss Melissa Vanek, Supervisory Special Agent for the FBI. I will be turning the floor over to her, and then if you have questions, put them in the chat. We will pause at some point to try to address those, if not address them at the end. Hopefully folks might be able to stay a little bit longer given we're having a late start, so that Melissa isn't pressed with trying to fly through her presentation. It's very detailed. And remember, this is different. This is from a law enforcement perspective, which means you are educated on the history. There's cases involved. And so some of it's going to be a little intense. I want to use that language in preparing you for what you're going to hear. With that, Melissa, thank you so much for joining us. Hopefully you caught your breath. But we'll turn it over to you if you want to get your presentation ready. The floor is yours.
Perfect. So, this one here. All right. And so, as Eric said, again, I apologize for being a little bit late here. We had some technical difficulties on my end. But again, my name is Melissa Vanek, and I am a supervisory special agent with the FBI Anchorage Field Office, which is our local field office here in the state of Alaska. And I actually oversee our white collar crime squad, which investigates, among other programs, the civil rights program, which includes hate crimes. So today I'm going to be providing, like Eric said, a presentation on disability, bias, hate crimes. And this is kind of a groundbreaking presentation because, like Eric said, we haven't ever given a presentation like this here in the state of Alaska. But when I reached out to my counterparts in other field offices and at our headquarters in Washington, D.C., I discovered that we actually hadn't given a presentation of this kind anywhere in the United States as far as anyone was aware. So hopefully this will be, if this presentation is successful and it's useful, then hopefully this will be a presentation that other field offices will be giving as well. So before I move on, I am going to try to turn off my video just because it tends to cause a lag with the PowerPoint presentation. So I'll turn off my video for most of the presentation, and then I'll bring my video back on at the end when we have time for questions. So let's see, there we go. All right, so let's jump into the presentation here. Why is this not going forward here? Okay. So before I begin, I do want to warn the audience that this presentation includes content that may be difficult, as Eric previously alluded to. So we're going to have content such as imagery and discussion related to bias-based physical violence, hateful conduct, and discrimination. So I do want to include that warning. The first part of the presentation is mostly just going to cover kind of a background and general overview of hate crimes, and then we're going to jump into some case examples, and that's really where we're going to get into some difficult content. So I just want to put that warning out there. So protecting civil rights is the #5 mission priority for the FBI. The FBI has established the Civil Rights Unit to oversee the Civil Rights Program, which has the mission of enforcing federal civil rights statutes and ensuring that the protected rights of all persons are not violated. The FBI Anchorage Field Office has several agents assigned to investigate civil rights violations, to include hate crimes. However, before we go any further, I think it's important to establish the definition of a hate crime, particularly a federal hate crime. So a hate crime is defined as any criminal offense against a person or property motivated in whole or in part by the individual's bias against a race, religion, disability, ethnic or national origin, sexual orientation, gender, or gender identity. And for the purposes of this definition, bias is defined as a preformed negative opinion or attitude towards a group of persons. However, in order to be investigated and prosecuted as a hate crime at the federal level, every hate crime must fall under one of 4 federal statutes. And we're going to go over those federal statutes in greater detail later in this presentation, because I think it's important to understand kind of what our limitations are as far as the FBI's ability to investigate hate crimes. So here are the current reported hate crime statistics for the United States. This data was obtained from the most recent FBI Uniform Crime Reporting Hate Crime Statistics. I know that's a mouthful, but you can find this at fbi.gov. And this data represents the total number of hate crimes reported for the entire United States. So this obviously isn't specific to Alaska. And as you can see, race, ethnicity, ancestry, religion, and sexual orientation account for almost 95% of all reported hate crimes. And hate crimes motivated by disability bias accounted for approximately 2% of all reported hate crimes. So disability bias hate crimes are, kind of a smaller percentage of reported hate crimes, but partly I think is because the FBI hasn't, and other law enforcement hasn't done a good job of educating communities on what constitutes a disability bias hate crime. And hopefully that's what we're going to start doing today. So in order to understand what a hate crime is, we must first discuss the difference between a hate crime and free speech, because that's very important. So the First Amendment guarantees the right to free speech, even when that speech is hateful or offensive. As such, offensive but non-threatening hate conduct is protected by the First Amendment. So some examples of non-threatening hate conduct include organizing a gathering to promote hate, circulating offensive materials, or posting bigoted views online. However, the First Amendment does not cover true threats or acts of violence, and a true threat puts the recipient in fear of physical or bodily harm. So, a comment is not a true threat if it's merely political hyperbole, if it threatens financial or emotional harm, but not bodily or physical harm. So that's really the key, that it has to threaten bodily or physical harm. Or if the comment's just merely offensive, no matter how offensive it is still protected by the First Amendment and is not considered a hate crime. So here are some examples of some true threat and act of violence examples that would be considered hate crimes because they involve either true threats or acts of violence. So a Facebook post threatening to harm a man because he is experiencing autism, followed by a physical assault on that man, that would be, a hate crime. A letter sent through the mail stating that members of a transgender support group should be shot because they are gay. Again, there's that, threat of an act of violence. And then the last one is graffiti at a mosque, which states "kill all Muslims," because again, that's there, you have that threat of violence. So it either has to be that threat of violence or the actual act or attempt of violence that makes it a federal hate crime. So let's look at a couple examples here, and we'll try to decide if these are hate crimes. So go ahead and look at this. For those of you who don't have video, this is what appears to be a garage door, and it has the word "Die Jews" spray painted in black on the garage door, along with some swastikas. So is this a federal hate crime? Well, yes, this would be considered a federal hate crime because it's considered a true threat aimed at an individual based on their religion or national origin at a dwelling occupied by that individual. So the true threat is based on the statement "Die Jews" and what the Nazi symbols represent to the Jewish community, which in this case put the recipient in fear of physical harm. So this would be a hate crime. So let's look at another example here. So is this a hate crime? So for those of you who can't see, it's an individual with a shaved head. It's a man with a shaved head who's wearing a shirt that has the F word with Islam under it written on the shirt, and he is holding an American flag. So is this a hate crime? Well, unfortunately, this would be considered non-threatening hate conduct, which is protected by the First Amendment. So promoting hate, even if it's offensive or racist, is not a hate crime. So that would be something that is protected under the First Amendment. As I previously mentioned, every federal hate crime must fall under one of 4 federal hate crime statutes, which are then enforced by the FBI and other federal agencies. And so I want to go over each of these in a little bit more detail, but we have the Federally Protected Activities Statute, the Church Arson Prevention Act, the Hate Crimes Prevention Act, and the Fair Housing Act. So these are the 4 statutes under which any hate crime would fall if it was to be investigated as a federal hate crime. So the first one we're going to look at is the Federally Protected Activities. And this statute prohibits willfully injuring, intimidating, or interfering with any person or attempting to do so by force or threat of force because of race, color, religion, or national origin. The Federally Protected Activities statute was passed as part of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And for every statute, we have what are called elements that must be met. So these are kind of the parts of the statute that must be met in order for it to constitute a hate crime. So the 4 elements of the statute for federally protected activities that must be met in order for it to be a hate crime would be: number 1, that the defendant used force or the threat of force, there's a true threat of a threat of force. 2, if the defendant acted willfully. 3, if the defendant acted because of race, color, religion, or national origin. And 4, if the defendant acted because the victim was enjoying a specific right, such as the right to attend a public school, the right to enjoy any benefit or service provided by the government, the right to employment, the right to serve in court, or the right to use a facility in interstate commerce, like a bus stop or a public highway or a train station. And as you can see with this particular statute, disability bias is not addressed under the statute, so disability bias would not be able to be, investigated or prosecuted under this particular statute. So then, so let's look at this. So is this a violation of federally protected activities based on what I just told you? A white college student places a noose and a Confederate flag around the statue of a Black man on a university campus. So is this the violation of the federally protected activities? Yes, because the 4 elements are met. So the student made a true threat by hanging the noose and Confederate flag, which are threatening racial symbols. Number 2, the student did it willfully. The student wasn't forced to do it. Number 3, the student did it based on a racial bias. And number 4, it interfered with other students' right to attend a public school. Therefore, all 4 elements of the statute were met, and this would be a federal hate crime. So let's look at the next statute. So this is the Church Arson Prevention Act statute, and this is pretty straightforward. So it prohibits intentionally defacing, damaging, or destroying religious real property, or attempting to do so because of the religious character of that property. Or it prohibits intentionally obstructing by force or threat of force any person in the enjoyment of that person's free exercise of religious beliefs or attempting to do so. So pretty straightforward. It's just basically if you're defacing, damaging, or destroying real religious property or preventing people from exercising their religious beliefs. And some examples of real religious property would include the obvious things like churches, synagogues, and mosques, but it can also include things like religious cemeteries or religious museums located on religious property. And again, this statute primarily addresses religious bias and does not address disability bias. So this is another statute that wouldn't be relevant to disability bias. But we do have two more statutes that we're going to get into that will be relevant to disability bias. But before we do that, let's look at this. Is this a violation of the Church Arson Prevention Act? So a masked individual etches a swastika and the words "Die Jews" into the front door of a Jewish synagogue. Is this a violation of the Church Arson Prevention Act? Yes, in fact, this meets both parts of the Church Arson Prevention Act, which really you only need to meet one part in order for it to be considered a hate crime. So the individual defaced and damaged real religious property because of the religious character of that property by etching swastikas and "Die Jews" into the door of the synagogue. Also, the individual obstructed by threat of force the enjoyment of free exercise of religious beliefs by the congregants of the synagogue. This was a death threat, and it was a threatening symbol to those who attended the synagogue. Thus, the act could be investigated as a federal hate crime under both parts of the Church Arson Prevention Act, but really we would only have to have one of those parts be relevant in order for it to be investigated. We don't have to have both, but in this case, it did have both. So now we're going to get into the two statutes that are relevant to disability bias. And so this is the Hate Crimes Prevention Act of 2009. It was expanded under the federal definition of hate, or it expanded the federal definition of hate crimes and added new federal protections against crimes that involve disability, gender identity, or sexual orientation. And so there are two parts to this this particular act. And part one is it prohibits intentionally causing bodily injury or attempting to do so because of actual or perceived race, color, religion, and national origin. So for part one, the elements are the defendant willfully causes bodily injury or attempts to do so with a dangerous weapon. And number two, the defendant acted because of race, color, religion, or national origin. Now, part one does not apply to disability bias hate crimes, but part two does. And in this case, part two is it prohibits intentionally causing bodily injury or attempting to do so using fire, a firearm, or a dangerous weapon because of actual or perceived religion, sexual orientation, gender identity, gender, national origin, or disability. So for part two, the elements that have to be met are number one, the defendant willfully caused bodily injury or attempted to do so with a dangerous weapon or fire. Number two, the defendant acted because of religion, sexual orientation, gender identity, gender, or disability. And number three, the offense was in or affecting interstate commerce. And for part one and part two, they don't cover threats, unlike the federally protected activities and Church Arson Prevention Acts that we already discussed. So for part one and part two of the Hate Crimes Prevention Act of 2009, you must have bodily injury or attempted bodily injury. And bodily injury does not include emotional or psychological harm. It must be actual physical harm. And then the third element of part two talks about interstate and foreign commerce. And you're probably asking, well, what does that mean? Well, interstate and foreign commerce can be anything that is affected by or affects a commercial activity or activities or products that cross state lines or national borders. So I'm going to give you a few examples because this is kind of one of those concepts that's a little difficult to understand. So something that would affect interstate or foreign commerce would be if travel occurred related to the offense. So if the subject or victim crossed state lines or international boundaries in connection with the offense. This can include physically crossing state lines or international boundaries, or it can include phone calls that cross those boundaries, emails that go to servers outside of the state, or text messages that are sent in between states. So it doesn't have to be physical travel, it just has to be that something traveled across state lines in connection with the offense. The next one would be if a weapon was used, so like a firearm or a other weapon that was used in the commission of the offense traveled in interstate or foreign commerce. And this is actually a pretty easy one to meet because oftentimes a gun manufactured in Idaho is then used in Alaska as part of the hate crime, and that counts as crossing those interstate or foreign borders. The location of the offense is another way that we can look at interstate and foreign commerce because if the offense occurred in a train station, at a bus depot, or on an interstate highway, These are all public places that therefore satisfy that interstate or foreign commerce. And then finally, if an economic loss resulted from the offense, so let's say the crime interrupted the victim from engaging in business or the crime closed down business, then that would affect commerce, and that too would satisfy the interstate foreign commerce requirement. So that's, it's a little difficult to understand, and that's one of those things that, with this particular Part 2 of the Hate Crimes Prevention Act of 2009, that has to be met, though, in order for it to be considered a hate crime. So let's look at this example. Whoops. Went too far ahead. So, is this a violation of the Hate Crimes Prevention Act of 2009? A man punches a 70-year-old woman experiencing blindness at a public bus stop. The victim sustains injuries that require her to be hospitalized for several days. The man records himself attacking the victim and making disparaging comments about those experiencing blindness. The man called this the knockout game. Well, yes, this would be a violation of the Hate Crimes Prevention Act of 2009, Part 2. So first, the man willfully caused bodily injury by punching the woman. The man acted because of disability based on the disparaging comments that he made about those experiencing blindness. And then 3, the offense was in or affecting interstate commerce because it occurred at a public bus stop. Thus, all elements of the statute were met, and this would be considered a federal hate crime. So the last statute that we're going to cover here is the Fair Housing Act. The Fair Housing Act prohibits using force or threats of force to willfully injure, intimidate, or interfere with any person's housing rights because of race, color, religion, national origin, gender, disability, or familial status. The Fair Housing Act was part of the Civil Rights Act of 1968, and in 1974, the act was expanded to include gender, and then again in 1988, the act was expanded to include disability and familial status. So the elements of this statute are that number 1, the defendant used force or threats of force. Number 2, that what the defendant did was done willfully and was not forced to be done. Number 3, that it injured, intimidated, or interfered with a person's housing rights. And number 4, because of race, color, religion, national origin, gender, disability, or familial status. So let's look at an example because I think that's the best way to apply this particular statute. So is this a violation of the Fair Housing Act? A property manager refuses to rent an apartment to someone who uses a wheelchair because the property manager does not want to make the necessary reasonable accommodations. So would this be a violation of the Fair Housing Act as it pertains to hate crimes? No, because the property manager is not using force or threat of force. Like I said, for almost all the federal statutes, we have to have either the threat of force or the use of force in order for them to be applicable. And even though the property manager is interfering with the person's housing rights due to disability, there was no force or threat of force, therefore it would not be applicable under this statute. So all elements of the Fair Housing Act must be met to include that use of force or threat of force, to willfully injure, intimidate, or interfere with a person's housing rights because of race, color, religion, national origin, gender, disability, or familial status. However, while this is not a federal hate crime, this offense could be in violation of other federal or state laws concerning disability or housing rights violations. So again, we're just looking at this through the lens of federal hate crimes. It doesn't mean that there aren't other applicable federal laws that would apply to any of these scenarios. So next, I'm going to walk you through 4 case examples of real disability bias hate crimes. Again, I want to remind you that these case examples include content that may be difficult, such as imagery and discussion related to bias-based physical violence, hateful conduct, and discrimination. And I want you to keep in mind as we're moving through these case examples that, again, there are only 2 federal statutes that are applicable to disability bias hate crimes. And those are Part 2 of the Hate Crimes Prevention Act of 2009 and the Fair Housing Act. So let's jump into these examples. So case example number 1, on December 31st, 2016, an 18-year-old student experiencing a mental disability was kidnapped by an acquaintance from high school in Chicago, Illinois. The victim was bound, gagged, and held captive at an apartment by the acquaintance and 3 of the acquaintance's friends. The victim was beaten, cut with a knife, taunted, and forced to drink from a toilet bowl. The torture was streamed on Facebook Live for 28 minutes. The victim was eventually released by his captors and was recovered by officers from the Chicago Police Department on January 3rd of 2017. The Hate Crimes Prevention Act of 2009 Part 2 was applicable to this case example because the attackers willfully caused bodily injury to the victim, the attackers acted because of the victim's disability, and the offense affected interstate commerce because part of the attack was streamed on Facebook Live, which meant it went, across the state and national boundaries. The defendants were all arrested and charged with numerous crimes to include hate crimes because they had targeted the victim in part due to the victim's mental disability. While this case qualified as a federal hate crime under the Hate Crime Prevention Act of 2009, this case was prosecuted at the state level instead of the federal level. And this was because the state of Illinois could also charge the attackers with aggravated unlawful restraint and aggravated battery with a deadly weapon, in addition to charging the attackers with a hate crime. So all 4 defendants ultimately pleaded guilty to a hate crime, and they were sentenced to 3 to 8 years in state prison. The next example that we're going to go over occurred in May of 2017. This was a 22-year-old man experienced cerebral palsy who parked his SUV in front of a 7-Eleven convenience store. Barry Baker and his friends were outside the 7-Eleven store when the victim arrived. As the victim walked into the store, Baker began making fun of the victim's disability by stumbling around to mock the way the victim walked. When the victim exited the store, Baker continued to imitate the way the victim moved. Then as the victim stood by his SUV, Baker sucker punched the victim in the face. Baker then fled the scene and was later arrested by the U.S. Marshal Service. Unfortunately, this case could not be prosecuted as a federal hate crime because the Hate Crimes Prevention Act of 2009 Part 2 is not applicable. This was due to the fact that while Baker willfully caused bodily injury to the victim and Baker acted because of the victim's disability, the offense did not affect interstate commerce. So no weapons were used during the attack. It occurred on private property at a 7-Eleven, and it wasn't streamed or texted or emailed to anyone else. So, while this case could not be prosecuted by, the federal government as a federal hate crime, it was prosecuted by the state of Pennsylvania as an assault charge. And in November 2017, Baker was sentenced to 6 years in state prison. This crime also resulted in the introduction of a state Senate bill that added intellectual and/or physical disabilities to the list that prosecutors in the state of Pennsylvania could consider when contemplating hate crime charges. I think this case is a great example and highlights the importance of the FBI's partnerships with local and state law enforcement agencies. Because even when the FBI is unable to investigate an incident as a federal hate crime because it doesn't fall under one of the 4 hate crime statutes, there are often state statutes for hate crimes, harassment, and assault that can be applied instead. So those partnerships are incredibly valuable for ensuring that these types of cases are prosecuted and investigated to the utmost. So case example number 3, this occurred from 2001 to 2011, and Linda Weston coerced 6 adults experiencing mental disabilities into designating her as their caretaker, which allowed her to illegally collect approximately $212,000 from the victim's Social Security disability payments. Linda targeted the victims because they were estranged from their families, and she convinced the victims to move in with her. The victims were held captive in locked rooms, basements, attics, and closets, and often in subhuman conditions. The victims were drugged, deprived of food and medical care, and they were forced to use buckets for bathrooms. Linda punished the victims by slapping, punching, kicking, stabbing, burning, and hitting them with objects. And Linda moved the victims from Pennsylvania to other states like Texas, Virginia, and Florida during their captivity. The victims' mental disabilities prevented them from escaping. The Hate Crimes Prevention Act of 2009 Part 2 was applicable to this case example because, number 1, Linda Weston willfully caused bodily injury to the 6 victims. Number 2, she acted because of the victim's disabilities. And number 3, the offense affected interstate commerce because Linda transported the victims to multiple states. In 2013, Linda Weston and 4 other co-conspirators were federally indicted on hate crime charges, in addition to kidnapping, murder, and forced human labor charges. In 2015, Linda pleaded guilty to numerous federal charges to include a hate crime. And the last case example we're going to go over occurred in August of 2015. And a 22-year-old woman who was experiencing autism moved into a mobile home near 5 relatives after the victim's mother passed away. Terry Nope, who was one of the relatives, became the payee for the victim's supplemental security income payments, which the victim received because of her disability. Terry and his wife, Raylene Nope, built a 6-by-8-foot cage out of chicken wire and plastic tarp in the backyard of their house, and they forced the victim to live in the cage. The relatives maintained control over the victim and prevented her from escaping and attempting to live elsewhere. The victim was forced to do housework and yard work and was physically punished or starved if she didn't complete the work. Deputies from the local sheriff's office rescued the victim in June of 2016. And this is where the victim had been kept. The Fair Housing Act, in addition to the Hate Crimes Prevention Act of 2009, Part 2, was applicable to this case example. And that's because, number one, the relatives forced the victim to live in a cage in the backyard. Number two, the relatives willfully prevented the victim from leaving the property, renting a home, and occupying a dwelling elsewhere. And number three, they did all of this due to the victim's disability. All 5 relatives were arrested and charged with numerous federal hate crimes, to include using force or threats of force to interfere with the Federal Fair Housing Act. Terry and Raylene Nope, the mother and father of the relatives, were sentenced to 28 years in federal prison each. So, the 4 cases that I just went over were extreme examples of disability bias hate crimes, but not all disability bias hate crimes are that egregious. Based on everything that you've learned today, if you believe that you've been the victim of a disability bias hate crime or a hate incident, or if you witnessed a potential disability bias hate crime or hate incident, there are multiple ways that you can report it, not only to the FBI, but local and state law enforcement as well. So for the FBI, you can call the FBI tip line directly at 1-800-CALL-FBI, and that's 1-800-225-5324. You can also submit an anonymous tip online at tips.fbi.gov. Again, that's tips.fbi.gov. And you can also just call the FBI Anchorage field office directly at 907-276-4441. Again, that's 907-276-4441. Additionally, you can always call 911, you can call your local police department, or you can contact the Alaska State Troopers to report a potential hate crime. You don't need to report it just to the FBI. Any law enforcement can take a report on hate crimes. The FBI works very closely with its local, state, and tribal law enforcement partners to investigate hate crimes. And as demonstrated in the case examples, even when the FBI is unable to investigate a hate crime under a particular federal hate statute, the FBI still works jointly with other law enforcement partners to ensure that all applicable charges are pursued. So, just because we can't investigate it doesn't mean that we won't work with our state, local, or other federal or even tribal law enforcement partners to ensure that the incident is investigated and prosecuted under whatever statutes might apply. So that's basically the conclusion of my presentation. I hope that it was informative and helped increase your understanding of federal hate crimes and kind of the complexities of investigating and prosecuting federal hate crimes under those 4 federal statutes, to include disability bias hate crimes. And I'll turn my camera back on here in a minute, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have related to this presentation or to the FBI in general.
Thank you, Melissa. Really appreciate that. And I know you wanted to do a little more interactive, but I really appreciate you moving your presentation the way you did. I appreciate it. There was a question, Amanda. Do you wanna ask and clarify what you were looking for in your question regarding the 7-Eleven? Well, what she put in the chat, Melissa, was given your example earlier, was if he was entering a 7-Eleven to purchase something that would have been manufactured in another state, that wouldn't qualify?
In this case, it wouldn't qualify because the actual crime that occurred wouldn't have been related to the purchase of that item. So the way we could have, so if the individual who attacked the victim, if that individual had purchased a bottle in the 7-Eleven and had used that bottle to hit the victim with that, then that would have affected interstate commerce and we could have charged it. But just having the victim going in and out of a business, because the attack occurred after the victim came out of the business and didn't impede the victim's ability to engage in commerce, we couldn't use that as the, affecting interstate commerce portion. So there are lots of ways and tricks that we use to try to get to that interstate commerce portion of the hate crime of that particular statute. But it's one of those that's very difficult, and we run into that a lot with these types of hate crimes when we're dealing with that part two. That interstate commerce element is really the hardest one for us to meet.
Melissa, are you able to pull down the presentation just so we can see each other? And then we had a hand raised. Denise, I see your hands raised. Do you have a question? I can't tell if folks are able to speak. Might be easier, Denise. We have to turn on your audio. Let us work on that. So hold your question, Denise. And I'm gonna go to Aaron. Aaron put in case number 2, Melissa, you mentioned there was no weapons used. Isn't a person's fist a weapon?
So under the definition of this in the statutes for the federal hate crimes, a fist in any part of a person's body is not considered a weapon. So a weapon would have to be something separate from the individual. And a weapon can be, anything really, though, that's separate from the individual. So it can be a rock, it can be a bottle, it can be a broomstick, it can be, just about anything. If any object is used to, physically assault another person, then we can define that as a weapon. But unfortunately, the federal definitions of a weapon preclude us from using any body part. So
have you had any situations, this is my question, Melissa, have you had any situations where persons utilizing Medicaid or Medicare funds, right, there's the split between state and federal, are having those frauded, or there's some sort of elder abuse involved that you've been involved in?
We haven't investigated them from a hate crimes perspective. We've investigated them from a healthcare fraud perspective. So we have had where individuals are abusing others, taking their Medicaid or Medicare funds. We can actually investigate. We can investigate some aspects of Medicaid. We can investigate Medicare, and we can investigate TRICARE, obviously, which is the military. And then we can also investigate anything where people are abusing also private insurance company payments to individuals who should be receiving those payments. So we have done it, but we've only done it from the perspective of a healthcare fraud. So we've looked at it more as theft of funds, or we've looked at it from an overbilling or misrepresentations of services rendered, those types of things.
And it looks like Denise asked, where do financial elder abuse fall into this? So Denise, hopefully you heard the question I just asked as well. It's real important, especially in some of our rural and remote areas. I also see a question here from Callista.
Do you want me to answer that financial elder abuse?
Oh yeah, go ahead, please.
So we do. So we have a separate elder fraud statute that we now have that the FBI can use. And so elder fraud, we typically investigate because most of the time they're financial crimes. And so we investigate it under our economic crimes unit, which includes financial crimes. And so we do open, most of our financial crimes cases right now do involve elderly individuals, unfortunately. A lot of them are targeted through online fraud, such as romance scams and impersonation scams and tech support scams, or through investment fraud, or through just individuals who are pretending to be close family members or friends and pretending to take care of them when really they're just stealing their money from them. So we do get a lot of those cases, and we do investigate them under that elder fraud statute, as well as other financial crime statutes. So we have a broad spectrum of statutes that can apply to those.
Looking through Denise, I see you're adding some other items. Denise, has been involved in several situations I'm aware of that has involved, especially with the department, the DHSS website compromise. A lot of folks were impacted. And so Denise asked, so does this also fall under the IC3 report? Should that be reported under the IC3?
Yeah, so IC3, for those of you who don't know, is our Internet Crime Complaint Center. And the FBI stood this up because we were having so many reports of crimes that were related to the internet or to cyber fraud. And so IC3 only deals with fraud or crimes that occur relating to the internet. And so that could be an email sent to your cell phone. It can be even text messages sent to your cell phone. It can be any kind of targeting on social media accounts or email compromises or phishing, those types of things. And so IC3 is the great repository where anyone can file a complaint, and we have a team of analysts who then review all of those complaints, and then they assign them out to the appropriate either state, local, or federal agency, to include the FBI, based on what the complaint is and who would have the best jurisdiction. They also have, for anyone who's been involved in what we call an email compromise, so where someone has compromised your email and induced a victim into sending wire transfer or money. It's either part of a real estate deal or a business transaction or even just a personal transaction. We have what's called the Recovery Asset Team, which actually works with financial institutions both domestically and overseas, and can often, if the fraud is reported in time, they can often recover that money by freezing it and then recalling it. And so they're able to work in real time in a way that isn't always typical of law enforcement. So as soon as they get the complaint, they can start to put into action the network that they have available in order to get that money back. But really, time is of the essence with those types of frauds, and they need to be reported as soon as possible because there's really about a 48-hour window where it's effective.
That's great. We have some really good questions still, Melissa. Callista asked, could you explain why a federal hate crime has to involve state commerce? Why was that made to be a requirement?
To be honest, it's just the way the statute was written, and I'm not exactly sure. I mean, basically, for the FBI to investigate any crime, it has to impact state commerce under Title 18 of the United States Code. And so the only exceptions to those tend to be, certain types of violent crimes, certain types of, terrorism, domestic terrorism. But most, even like when we look at like wire fraud and mail fraud, which are two of the statutes that we use the most for frauds, it has to travel interstate or it has to affect commerce. So almost any fraud we do also has the same requirement. And for some of the statutes, it's just the way that they were written as part of our justice system. I didn't have any say in that, obviously, but I am confined by why they decided to write that. But really, what gives the FBI our investigative authority under the Constitution is related to interstate commerce. Most of our statutes are related to interstate commerce, and so unfortunately, they have tied some of these hate crime statutes to interstate commerce as well, in order for them to fall under that Section 18 of, or Title 18 of the United States Code. So,
I have a comment and question here from Jenna Amber. Regarding hate crimes under the Fair Housing Act, I just wanted to clarify, it might still constitute discrimination under the Fair Housing Act if someone is denied housing due to their disability. It just wouldn't be considered a hate crime because there was no use or threat of force. Is that right?
Correct. So the Fair Housing Act covers other types of discrimination too. And so for the purposes of this presentation, we were only talking about hate crimes, but certainly there can be other violations of the Fair Housing Act that wouldn't be a hate crime, but could still be, part of, discrimination in housing or, not providing reasonable accommodations and things like that. It just wouldn't be a hate crime. But yes, most of these statutes expand and involve other non-hate crime related violations that could potentially be charged. And I think that's what I do want to stress, is that just because we can't charge something as a hate crime doesn't mean that we can't charge it as something else. So for the purposes of this presentation, we were focusing on disability bias hate crimes, but certainly a lot of incidents that may be reported to us as a potential hate crime may not fall under that umbrella of hate crime, but maybe we can use another statute or another charge in order to ensure that justice is brought to that particular incident.
We have a question from Roy Scheller. Do people experiencing disabilities have equal protection under the existing laws as other people?
I mean, they have equal protection based on the statute that we can apply. And I think that's, one of the important things to realize is that, disability bias was not added to a lot of these statutes until fairly late. So when these statutes were first created, they were primarily related to the Civil Rights Act, and they had primarily to do with racial bias and ethnic origin bias. And then obviously those biases have been expanded over time based on the realization that, hey, hate crimes don't just target those particular groups of individuals, they target lots of other groups as well. And so fortunately Congress did act, and they did pass these other statutes that would include that, but they do have their limitations. And so, I think part of the reason we have underreporting on disability bias hate crimes is I just believe that a lot of people out there don't realize that some of the things that they're experiencing, or some of the incidents that occur, would be applicable under one of these, federal statutes for disability bias hate crimes, because I just don't think that we as the FBI have done a very good job at educating, our communities about what disability bias hate crimes are and what statutes are applicable to those particular hate crimes.
One more question. It goes back to the IC3 and that other information. The NICE further asks, what do we do if the elder gave them their social security number? So, with all of these scams going on, that sort of thing.
So, I mean, you can obviously report it depending on if it was done. If it was done, anything that's internet related or online related, you can report it to IC3. Otherwise, you can call and report it directly to the FBI through either the tips, FBI tips.gov, or tips.fbi.gov, or you can call the Anchorage field office and we'll take a report. There are other steps that we can send it to. So there are other agencies that also deal with it, to include, the State Department, to include, the Secret Service gets involved with some of the identity theft stuff. We have, I'm trying to think off the top of my head, there are several other agencies that all kind of play a different role in how we investigate and try to prevent some of these, these particular thefts of information, particularly from the elderly. So the best way is just report to the FBI, and then we can make sure that if it's something that we don't address directly, we can get it to the federal agency that does, address it directly.
One last question. This is from me. Just given what you've put together, your research addressing this group, is there, what have you learned that you can help take to the other field offices to help educate your coworkers and the FBI in terms of how to educate their communities?
I think, what I've learned today is that, given that, we really haven't done this outreach with these communities, and not just, formal presentations, but even like, the first step where you were at our Citizens Academy and you came forward and said, hey, I don't, does the FBI offer any kind of, information or presentations on disabilities bias hate crime? And to be honest, when you first asked that question, we didn't have an answer. And I had to go and talk to our headquarters components, and I had to talk to our other field offices. And what I discovered is that no one really had that answer. And if we had been doing adequate outreach with our communities, we shouldn't have had to go this long without actually creating, a presentation that would address, at least foundationally, disability bias hate crimes. And so what I'm hoping to do is, based on kind of the feedback I've received today, is to use this as a, a baseline as a starting point, and then building upon that, and hopefully creating a much more robust outreach to these communities, and really getting their input and feedback on areas where we do need to provide additional information, or areas where, we are lacking in our outreach, or just in areas where we're not, addressing these issues adequately. And so I hope that this will really serve as that jumping off point for that, as a springboard for, building a more robust outreach effort and just interaction with our communities on disability bias hate crimes.
I have a feeling you're going to have some people reaching out to you. In fact, the NICE is asking, how can I get a presentation in my community for elders and disabled citizens?
And we're happy to do that. So, and again, it's part of it is just having people like you reach out and tell us, this is a presentation that needs to be done. We have limited resources in the Anchorage field office, and so we direct those resources as best we can, but we can always pivot our resources to communities that are reaching out to us and saying, we need this interaction, we need this this information and this education, so that we can start reporting more of these even if they're, I want to really stress that even if you don't think it meets the federal definition of a hate crime, hate incidents, when enough people report them to us, it helps us draw a picture of what's going on and build a bigger picture. And sometimes that can get us over that threshold for the hate crime. So if enough hate incidents that don't quite meet that threshold on their own, but are combined together and show a pattern of behavior, then we can often get over that threshold for being able to prosecute it as a federal hate crime. So it's not just about, I know that was one of the questions I've had just in general hate crime presentations that I've given in the past is, do I even need to report hate incidents when I know it's not going to reach that threshold? Well, yes, because multiple hate incidents together could meet that threshold. And, it helps us really identify individuals or groups that may be targeting communities, and maybe the individual incidents on their own, don't meet that threshold, but maybe when we combine them, we can get there to where we could prosecute them under a hate crime.
There's a few other questions in related to how does one go about participating in the Citizens Academy. Maybe we can get Chloe to send some information out, Melissa, related
Absolutely.
to that.
Yeah,
Folks, what I'll do is I'll work with Melissa and Chloe to get some more info and get it out and distribute it to people that are on this list here. And there's other questions related. Can folks get a hold of you directly, Melissa? Do you?
Yes, if they call the FBI Anchorage field office number that I included in the presentation, and they can ask for me directly, and they'll be sent to my desk line.
Okay, and then that leaves to getting a copy of your presentation. Are you comfortable with us sharing that with everybody?
Yes, I am.
Okay, all right. Well, the last thing that we typically do, because I'm trying to be mindful, and I really appreciate folks hanging out a little bit longer, is we usually have door prizes. So I want to pass it on to Bridget. Can you come on and share who got chosen out of our hat of tricks for this month's door prizes?
Yeah, absolutely. So this month's door prize winners are Lori Hoden, Nishama Sir, Tatiana Jordan, and Catherine Severin.
Very nice. What do they get?
What do they get, Eric?
Well, generally we provide books, and the books that is going to be highlighted today is it is called Civil Disabilities, Citizenship, Membership, and Belonging. It's a 2019 book, but it's pretty pertinent to the conversation today, and we're very excited about that. So we'll get that out to the award winners that Bridget just named and placed in the chat box, so you can see there. And so folks will hear, so we can get your addresses and get those sent out. Wow, again, thanks, Melissa. We really appreciate this. We understand it's the inaugural presentation. I mean, my goodness, it's well past due. You did it very, very well. You gave it very good justice in presenting this, and I hope others learn from you on this. In terms of the question on the recording is yes, they will be placed in YouTube, as we chatted about a little bit earlier. And things that we're looking to do is just into the future. We thought we'd just do this for a little bit, but we keep having topics and questions raised, and so we're moving them forward. We anticipate having a future discussion on employment for folks who experience disabilities. We expect to have an interview with Miss Wheelchair Alaska. Some of you may be familiar with her. We look to have a presentation on reproductive rights for persons experiencing disabilities, gender identity and disabilities. If folks have topics, please move them forward. We'll do our best to see how we can have those occur and or look for presenters, sometimes amongst those of you who are here on this presentation today. Advocacy is everybody's right. That's the whole point of why we're performing this at this time. But advocating for my team, we got to get better with our tech, and we're going to keep being fluid as we learn how to make this happen, because it's so needed and people seem to get so much from it. I also understand the time might be a challenge, so I would ask for some feedback on there. I might recommend it becomes a brown bag sort of event that happens over the lunch hour. That might make it a little easier for folks, because Wednesday seems to be a critical time for most teams to meet. Anyways, with all that, you guys, you know, together we are better. You all matter. One of our credos here is be strong, be capable, be kind. Melissa, again, thank you, thank you, thank you. You guys, Melissa Vanek, supervisory special agent from the FBI. Really, really appreciate your work today. Thank you.
Yeah, and sorry about the technical difficulties and the late start, but at least we were able to get through it. So
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.